Good morning. It is great to see you, and I'm so glad again that you're here. We've got a few extras that have joined us this morning, and if you don't have the handouts that we gave last night, raise your hand, and Rob will get those to you, but we will try to move through those together as best we can. There is a book that you can download in its entirety on our website, and so if you prefer an electronic version, it's at BiblePassages.net, and there's a drop-down menu that you can navigate to that I think is under Learn, or anyway, I've forgotten which button it's under, but there's a book there that you can download the book if you'd prefer that. And there's a lot more to that material than just what we've handed out here. But again, welcome, glad you're here, and so important that we're spending time in thinking about our traveling down the road of marriage. And as we mentioned last night, marriages often begin in a car, don't they? Right after the wedding ceremony, we get in the car and we drive off. And so that makes a great analogy for how we want to approach marriage. As we're trying to reach a destination, the destination of heaven and the destination of happiness and peace and joy, how do we get down the road in a safe way? We want to be like this couple, right? I mean, that is what's pictured in a lot of different magazines, and the ideal couple, everybody is so happy and they look beautiful, and this is what everybody aspires to, right? But the reality is that this is probably more like most couples, right? We're usually pretty upset. We don't look like those couples in the previous picture. This may characterize us. And so when we make that contrast between that and then this, we think, well, we're just never going to be happy. Or the reality is this is who we are, and we can never, attain to what we'd like to be. But let me tell you, as we've been talking about this weekend, this is more the reality of what most couples face, and yet it doesn't have to be this way. And while we're all not going to certainly look like that, and they probably don't even look like that, right? Because they've been airbrushed and everything, and the magazines have really edited all that to make them look, the photographs to make them look a certain way. I do want us to recognize that as we travel down the marriage road, it can get a little challenging. And sometimes we can find ourselves sort of locked in a traffic jam, and we're frustrated, just like some of you who've been in a traffic jam before have been frustrated. It can be exasperating. I remember the first time that I drove in Jamaica, in Kingston, and there, if they have 2 lanes, that really means 4 lanes or 5 lanes for them, right? And they'd go. That was my first experience with what they called a roundabout. In Texas, we just had intersections. Now we're seeing more of those, and with lights. But you had to get on that roundabout, and I mean, if it was 2 lanes, again, it didn't matter. There were 6 cars across, and you're trying to wedge your way in there, and it's frightening, and it's dangerous, and frustrating, and that's the way sometimes marriage can be. When we get in our marriage car, we drive down the road, we find ourselves running into some road rage and into some conflict. And so how do we manage that? Reminded of a story about a preacher that one Sunday morning decided that he would speak about how to resolve marriage conflict. And so after he got through near the end of his sermon, he says, I want to remind each of you of just how important Jesus is in our life and what he did in sacrificing himself for all of us. So when you think about the conflict in your marriage, I want you to think about sacrifice. And to remind you of that, I'm going to give each one of you a wooden cross. And I'll be at the back of the auditorium, and when you file out, take one of these wooden crosses, and I want you to put it in some place in your house where you guys end up, fighting a lot. And so one lady walked up to him and said, I would like 6 of those crosses. And she said, 6? He said, why? Because we fight all over the house, she said, and so I want to put one in each of the rooms. Well, that may be you, I don't know, but we want to talk about how to eliminate some of the real hurt and the frustration that goes along with conflict. So let's talk a little bit about that today. And as we do, I want us to recognize and realize, first and foremost, that conflict is inevitable. It really is. Problems are bound to come up anytime two people get together, and even more than just for a short while. And sooner or later, some may arise that are serious enough to wreck the relationship unless you know how to handle them. But even though it's a fact of life, the second paragraph reminds us that, you know what? If we get it going in the right direction, it can actually be a positive thing. And I want you to think about that this morning. Conflict is inevitable, but if we handle it in the right way, it can actually be a positive thing. Proverbs 27:17 basically says this: as iron sharpens iron, so a man sharpeneth the countenance of his friend. And what I visualize there is two hard substances coming together, like a knife and a piece of steel. Or when I was growing up, we had what we called a wet rock, right? A hard piece of flint or a hard piece of granite or basalt rock, and you'd use it to sharpen your knife on. Two hard substances. And it's interesting, right? If you take steel and you take a knife and you get it going in the right direction, you can actually sharpen the knife. But if you take that steel and turn it this way and the knife in that way, and you have the clash that exists, it can dull the knife. It's all a matter of how you come together in that clash. When two people come together, there is a natural clash that's going to occur. We all are different. We have different personalities, let alone the difference between male and female, and don't want to overgeneralize that, but the point is it's true, right? We're different. We come from different families, and we have different likes and dislikes and different ways of doing things. And so as we try to blend our life together, there's a natural clash that can occur. But if we get that clash going in the right way, it can actually be helpful because it will rub off the rough edges in our life. No one is going to see you at your worst more than your spouse will. They're going to know the things that need to be changed in your life. They can help you to become a better person. And that's a part of the beauty of marriage, is how God designed it. The coming together of two people to blend their life together into one unit. And you will never be one if you don't recognize that conflict is going to be there and learn how to handle it. Because if you learn how to handle it, that actually can make you a better person. So a lot of times when we are doing premarital counseling with couples, we ask them, do you anticipate any kind of marriage problems in your life? Sometimes it's obviously very evident from an early stage in their development or in the relationship. But other times, they're still in this sort of pseudo world of perfection and love, and they don't realize that it's going to be hard. It's going to be challenging. Most couples find it very, very difficult to try to blend their life into one. And so recognizing that it's all a part of life is very critical. There's not something wrong with us if we have conflict, okay? There's not something wrong with us if we have conflict. Now, Carla and I have discussed this a lot, that, my parents I never really saw them. I mean, they argued a little bit for fun and different things, around the house, but I never ever saw them get into any kind of serious argument. And so the first time Carla and I got into a very serious disagreement about things, I thought our marriage was over, I mean, just what's going on here? And because I didn't understand that sometimes, it gets really challenging, and our emotions really play a role in this, and it can be very, very hard. So what we want to talk about is how to resolve this, how to communicate, how to resolve conflict in an effective way, how to deal with the road rage, as it were, and the logger jams, and all the times that we come together and we find an impasse occurring in our lives. So the first thing we've got to learn to do in resolving conflict is to learn how to communicate effectively, okay? That's number one. If we're going to resolve conflict and deal with rage and anger, we've got to learn how to communicate effectively. So let's talk a little bit about that. And as we do, let's recognize the importance of this quote that says, communication is to love what blood is to life. It's impossible to have any kind of relationship unless there is communication. I can't live without blood. And a relationship cannot survive if husband and wife don't communicate. Now, that's essential to dealing with problems, to resolving conflict, to our understanding the process of getting close to one another. But why is it that we don't do it? Why do we don't communicate? And why do we don't communicate well? What do you think?
I think people are avoidant.
They what?
Avoidant.
Okay.
They avoid conflict.
Okay, they avoid it, right? Because it's not fun, it's hurtful. And that's one of the most important things we're going to talk about in here is that we've got to learn to deal with it more effectively so that we're used to handling it.
She said conflict.
Okay. And the other thing, any other reasons why we don't communicate? Why it's so hard?
Well, if you were brought up in a family that never communicated, that you kind of keep that with you.
Okay. Yeah, we don't see it modeled, and so we don't know how to handle it.
We have a very busy life, we have distractions, we have the children, we have our jobs. A lot of things can get in the way.
Yeah. And what happens is, if we don't talk, we over time grow further and further and further apart. Yes, sir?
Guilt and embarrassment.
Okay. Yeah, we don't feel comfortable. The environment that exists within our relationship is not such that we feel comfortable about being vulnerable or transparent about our feelings. And so guilt suppresses it, and we never really get out the things that we need to talk about that are getting in the way of our being one. Well, communication is hard, too, for some people. Finding the right words to describe how we feel can be very challenging. And some of us may be better at articulating our feelings and our processors out loud, right? You ever know people that process out loud and they talk through things, and then some others don't say things because they're afraid they're going to say the wrong things, and maybe they're afraid that someone's going to be critical of what they say. So we're going to kind of go through some things to help us get to the point of where we feel more comfortable with communicating. But we have to understand it is essential. It's hard work, but the payoffs are huge. The payoffs are huge. Now, to go through and we'll get to some scripture here that's going to really help us, but we're laying the foundation here of realizing that a vital aspect of communication, now notice, is the manner, it's very important, in which we send messages. Communication is not just about talking, right? Some people can talk, but just because we're talking doesn't mean that we're being heard or understood. So what we want to emphasize from Scripture, especially in a moment, is to see that communication must involve our thinking about the way we talk, the manner in which we talk. This is an interesting study that has determined that when people are trying to figure out the meaning of a message, it involves content, it involves tone, and it involves nonverbal communication. With changes in tone or a voice or in the nonverbal component, it's possible, now notice, to express many different messages using the same word, statement, or question. Understanding what someone else is trying to say can be very difficult because we often communicate with things other than just words, right? Our tone of voice can really puzzle people. Well, what does he mean, or what did she mean? Let me give an example of what I'm talking about. Listen to this statement. I'm going to say it several different ways. I didn't say she stole the purse. 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 Now, every one of those sentences had the exact same content, word for word, right? But did all of those sentences have the same meaning? No. What made the difference? Our tone, right? The inflection of our voice, the emphasis we gave to certain words changed the meaning of that sentence. Some of us are not being heard because we are putting people on the defensive by the tone that we use. We aren't listening as well because we feel attacked. Or maybe because one thing is being said on one level, but the meaning is something totally different, right? I told you I love you. Right? You ever had anybody say that? Okay, I feel really loved, right? When you're telling me so strongly. It doesn't matter what you say, if the tone doesn't always match up with it, it's confusing. It's what in communication is called a double bind, right? The words say one thing, but the tone or even the body language says something else. Now, I remember in college reading a study about a young man who was at a state hospital who was having a lot of trouble and difficulties, and every time his mother came to visit, the family or the clinicians and those who were taking care of this child began to realize he's always more visibly agitated when mom comes to visit. And they're like, what's going on here? And so they began to observe a little more closely, the dynamics of that relationship. And one of the things they noticed about mom is that she was constantly putting her son in a double bind. In other words, they noticed when she would communicate with her son, especially maybe after she saw him for the first time, that he'd come running up to her, all the excitement, enthusiasm, mom's coming to visit, mom's coming to visit. And then when he got there and would reach out to hug her, she would immediately stiffen up. She wasn't the hugging kind of type and didn't like it or whatever. And then he felt the frigidity, the coldness of her body language, and he kind of backed away. And she would say, well, what's the matter, Johnny? Don't you love me? Okay. He and all of us understand that body language and tone communicate something. But when our words say one thing and our tone and our body language say something else, it is confusing. It's contradictory. It puts us in a bind because we're trying to figure out, well, what does it mean? So what I am going to show you from Scripture is that God emphasizes all of these components of both what we say and how we say things. Now, your outline material will have some of these items here and things that you can even fill in as we go along, if I recall correctly. But the first thing we want to emphasize is what Paul said in Colossians 4:6, that our speech always needs to be with grace, seasoned with salt. See, that's the two elements of communication. We want to resolve conflict. We've got to think about what we say and how we say things. Because if we're not careful about what we say and how we say things, then we're going to stifle communication. People are going to shut down if we're not thoughtful. Now, I know we're going to make mistakes, and we'll talk about forgiveness, we'll talk about patience, and learning this process. It takes a lot of long suffering and patience. But we have to start with understanding that what we communicate can put people on the defensive, it can be critical, it can be harmful, and it can be hurtful. What I say is important, but equally important is how I say it. Speech that is with grace and that's seasoned with salt. Okay, well, what does that mean specifically, right? Because we can say that in a general principle, but practically what does it look like? Well, let's talk a little bit about that. If a, person here says, wife's name, Susie, stop by the store on your way home from work. That's different from, and then she may say, stop by the store on your way home from work, okay, almost in a command, imperative language, as opposed to maybe, what if she says, honey, how would you feel about stopping by the store on your way home from work, right? It's a lot harder to be frustrated about that. I just want to get home. And you want me to do what? Well, if she says, how would you feel about it? Well, I don't feel very great about it, but I'm going to be a lot more receptive to wanting to maybe follow through on that. So that's changing the way we think about things. Now, you may not know what it is that you've been saying that, your wife or your husband has a difficulty with. And we've got to be willing to hear and listen to what our spouse is saying, which we'll get to in a little bit later on, but listening is a huge part of the communication process. But if we start with understanding that I can choose words that are a little more appropriate and careful to stimulate receptivity in communication, it makes all the difference in the world, all right? Well, here's another thing about speech that is with grace, seasoned with salt. It is guarded and it's not impulsive. Someone read Proverbs 12:16 for me. Who has that? And then someone else read Proverbs 10:19. Okay? Someone read Proverbs 12:16, and then someone read Proverbs 10:19. Speech that is with grace, seasoned with salt, is guarded. It's not impulsive.
Fool's anger is known at once, but a prudent man considers dishonor.
Okay? So, think about what you're saying. When we're angry, it's easy to just say the first thing that's on our heart and on our mind. But sometimes that's not the best, right? What's the next one say? Who has that one?
In there are many words, sin is unavoidable, but the one who controls his lips is wise.
Okay, he who controls his lips is wise. Now we're going to get to a point where we understand that in communication, we've got to create an environment where we feel comfortable with talking and maybe saying things that are on our heart without someone judging us to say, okay, I know that's what they, who they really are. Sometimes we don't always know how to say it. Some people are better with talking than others. But creating an environment where we feel comfortable with sharing our heart without being criticized. But the other side of that is slowing down, measuring your words. I read one time in a magazine, it was a faith-based magazine about communication and marriage and what we say. And in the title of the magazine was 3 Dangerous Words. And the words were, I want, like I said, 4. Well, I want a divorce. Well, what happened was this woman was talking about early on in their marriage that she got frustrated and her and her husband were fighting about something. And so she wanted to just express her frustration. And she says, I want a divorce. Well, she said, as soon as I said it, I knew I didn't mean it, and that's not what I wanted. But she meant it as a way to really hurt him. And it did. Not only did it hurt him, but it also created a whole sort of framework of doubt. What is she really thinking? What's going on here? And the point is, and James reminds us, right, in the book of James about controlling our tongue, and that it's unruly, it's difficult, but it can set on course, a world with fire, and it can bring about division. It's harmful, and we've got to really think about the fact that our tongue can really bring about a lot of harm. What we say is important. So guard your tongue. Don't use profanity, of course, but also don't use demeaning language, hurtful language. Think about what you're saying and how it may be perceived. So a whoever refrains his lips and thinks about it is going to be truly wise. So speech that is with grace is guarded. It's not impulsive. Think about this. No, you are remembering it all wrong. Right? In the middle of an argument, and we're talking about something, and we're really just quick to say, that's not the way it is, as opposed to maybe saying, you may be right. See, what that does is say, I'm not saying that you are right, that you may be right. That's a lot different, isn't it? No, you're remembering it all. That's not how it happened. Immediately, we've got this strong disjunctive, right? There's this strong division that occurs. But this allows us to suggest that you may be right, I may be right, I don't know. Let's see if we can figure this out. We save face in this situation, right? That's what we're sometimes wanting. You may be right. Different ways of saying things. All right, abounding in speech is thoughtful. It's not accusatory. Someone read Proverbs 25, verse 11 for us. It's thoughtful. It's not accusatory.
A word fitly spoken is like apples of gold in settings of silver.
Okay, that's a beautiful passage, isn't it? A word fitly spoken is like apples of gold in settings of silver. If you were to walk into this church building one day and maybe sitting up here on a table were these apples that were shiny and almost golden looking as they reflected the light, and then they were set around them in a bowl of silver, it would probably capture your attention, wouldn't it? The contrast between the silver and the gold. What happens when jewelers are trying to sell you some jewelry, right? They usually put it on a black cloth. There's a contrast. Or some of you that are in the culinary arts, what happens usually with food when they want to sell it to you? What do?
Presentation.
How they present it, right? How they present it. Or they may put a little garnish around it, that green stuff that when I was a kid I thought was food, and it turned out it wasn't. It's food, but I didn't like it very much, right? It was actually put there to sort of complement or to contrast so that it brings color to the food, so it's a little more palatable. And what I believe the writer here is saying is that we can say something in one way, but if we'll just think about how we're presenting it, it can be much more pleasant to the eye and be received. It's sort of like what I call putting a frame around it. Putting a frame around something. You ever had a photograph or a picture and looks nice, but then someone will pick out a nice mat that goes around it and that color accentuates what's inside the picture? I think you can maybe begin to see some of that as an example. Look at this. You don't spend time talking to me anymore. You just rush into sex. Now, what's wrong with that statement? It may be exactly how he or she feels about something, but it's what? Okay, very selfish because, yeah, and it's accusatory. Yeah, okay. All right. And it puts people on the defensive, doesn't it, right away? It's accusatory. See, you don't spend time. Well, it may be very true. It may be that the husband is, in this situation, very insensitive. And he just rushes into it and makes her feel as though she's just an object. And that's happened in some relationships. Okay? And that's how she feels. But if the object is wanting to be heard, then we need to think about how we're saying something. Put a frame around it. Try to present it in a better way. Now, that takes a lot of work and effort. There's no doubt, right? Trying to choose our words. But do we want to be heard, or do we want someone to throw up a wall? What's the difference? How can we approach it differently? What if she said, I love it when we spend time talking. I need a lot of hugs and attention before making love. I can't get enough of your hugs. You see, what that says is what I feel and what I need, as opposed to what you're not doing. I can tell you when it comes to resolving conflict that we have a tendency towards self-preservation, to protect ourselves. I mean, it's just sort of a natural tendency, right? If I were to go up to somebody and get ready to, someone were to come up to you and throw a fist at you, or they're going to act like they're going to do it. They come at you. What stance or posture are you going to take? Defensive, right? For me, it's probably retreat. Oh, I'm going to run. I'm going to run away. They're coming after me. No, someone's coming after me. Usually, I'm kind of like this, right? I'm ready to defend myself. Just block their punch or something. We throw up walls, right? When people attack us, we're ready. We don't want to be hurt or harmed. Now, what happens emotionally? What happens when someone attacks us verbally? Same thing. I'm going to protect myself. We may not throw up our fist, but we throw up a wall and put this hedge around us, as it were, and we're not going to let you in. Because I don't like being attacked. I want to feel safe. And the way I feel safe is I'm not going to let you in. But what have we said about marriage? Marriage demands that we be one. And if we're going to be one, we have to be transparent. And if we're going to be transparent, we have to be vulnerable. But I get it. It's a natural tendency to preserve self. So what we have to do is work at creating an environment where we don't feel attacked. And it's important that we communicate about things, because sometimes we may be saying something to our spouse that we don't even know is attack mode. From our perspective, it doesn't come across as being harsh or critical or judgmental. But the other person perceives it that way. Now, listen to this statement, because I believe this is very important. I mentioned it last night, but now in a little different context. What is perceived is oftentimes just as important as what is real. What is perceived is oftentimes just as important as what is real. We've sat with couples and he says, I am not critical. I just don't do that. Okay, Bill, I know, I'm sure you don't do that. But what is it do you think that you're doing that is saying to her that you are? Because you don't want her to think you're critical, do you? Well, that's her problem. No. I'm saying, what are you willing to invest in the relationship? What is it that you're saying or doing that's making her think that? Okay, I know, Bill, you're not critical and harsh. I know, okay. Most of the time they are. But anyway, right, because we have a hard time looking at ourselves. I know you're not harsh and critical, but she's perceiving you in that way. Is that the way you want to be perceived? No, of course not. Well, what is it that maybe you're doing that's causing her to think that? Because the goal is to create an environment of vulnerability and safety, not of criticism and harshness. So, thinking about how we frame things. A word fitly spoken is like apples of gold in settings of silver. The goal is for us to be heard and understood. But if there are things that are getting in the way of our demeanor or our, tone, then let's talk about it. And as we talk about that process and what our nonverbals might mean to someone, we have to work at not being overly sensitive about things. I'll give you a case in point. Maybe you're just being kind of who you are, and there's nothing sinful in the sense of kind of how you're maybe just a little bit gruff about things, although I would argue that you need to soften and work on that, But maybe that's just kind of who you are. And you say, well, I don't understand. I'm not doing anything wrong or sinful, so she needs to accept this. Have you ever thought about the fact that maybe she had an employer or a father or a previous relationship that was abusive, and the way that he manifested himself and his tone got connected to the abuse. And so when she hears you talking like that, she shuts down, she runs away, she's fearful. The association, the connection she makes because of that. See, that's important for us to kind of talk about and to figure those kinds of things out. Why is she fearful? Why is she interpreting this in this way? Well, it could be because of something from her past that she's connecting to that. And so you need then to work overtime to say, I don't want her to feel that or to think that or to connect that in some way or to be fearful. I want her to feel safe. Now, that means we need to give a lot of thought to thinking about how we say things and why we say them. All right, so what else is speech that is grace, seasoned with salt? It's specific and not generalized. How are we going to learn to deal with road rage and problems and resolve conflict? Learn how to communicate effectively. Work at it. And one of the things we can do is to be careful about this. Proverbs 25, verse 11. What does that say?
A word filthy spoken is like apples of gold in the setting of silver.
All right, so it's another time here that what we say, how we say it, is extremely important. So here is an example of what I'm talking about. You ever said this? You never listen to me. You never take out the trash. You never help with things around the house. You never do we ever say those things? And we may feel, right, that they never did that. But I can tell you, as a man, if someone says to me, you never did this, or if Carla says, and she doesn't say this to me, but if she says, you never take out the trash, guess what my response is going to be? Yes, I did. Now, it was 10 years ago, but I did it, right? I did it. And so therefore, because I did it one time, that totally discredits you. Why should I believe anything you're saying? Because you're saying I never did it, but you forgot the one time I did it. So why should I do it, right? Well, we have to understand the frustration that they may feel because the trash is constantly being is being overlooked a lot. And we have to hear that. But on the other hand, again, if the goal is being heard, can we find another way of saying it? Honey, could you help with the trash? Or it's really piling up in here, and I know you do a lot, and I know that you're very busy, but we talked about, or whatever it is, be careful about overgeneralizing, right? At times I feel like I'm not being heard instead of you never listen to me. See the difference? At times I feel like, so you're taking ownership for this, because it may not be the case. Maybe he thinks he is listening to you. The point is that she doesn't feel like she's being heard. Maybe let's say as an elder in the church, do you want your flock to feel like that they're never heard? I had a guy come and speak to us at Bear Valley at one of our retreats that talking about elderships and how to help elderships and leadership and all that. And as he would go and work with congregations that were having a lot of trouble, he would tell the elders, the first thing you guys need to do is you just got to do a lot of listening. Because the congregation as a whole feels like that you're not listening. And sometimes we just need to feel like we're being heard, that people are listening to us, that they care enough to know what I think, what I feel. And that goes a long way to resolving conflict when we feel like we're being heard. It doesn't mean, and we'll emphasize this in the next session, it doesn't mean that we have to agree on everything. Sometimes it means that we just got to be heard. So, resolution doesn't always mean agreement. There are a lot of things Carla and I will never agree on. Where to put a glass after I'm through drinking it, right, where it goes. We'll go to our grave never agreeing with where that glass goes. Because I think that the glass should go on the counter because I'm going to use it again later, right? She says, what happens is there's like 20 or 30 glasses scattered around all throughout the day. I don't see it that way, right? I think I'm going to use one glass and use, because I was a bachelor and I didn't like washing dishes, I remember that, and so I'd use the same glass for 20 years, right, over and over. Now, well, she wants me to put it in but to me that's like, well, I'm going to use it again, it's going to get dirty. I don't want all those dirty dishes down there with my glass I'm going to drink out of. We're never going to agree on that. But I can certainly come to a conflict resolution to say, you know what, this is her area, that she, in our division of labor in the home, and this is an area that she's taking care of here. I can certainly be willing to concede and to say that's where it ought to go. Mm-hmm.
There's a song about conflict between a father and a son, and I like the verse of it because it always says you can listen as well as you hear. And sometimes we hear, but we're not listening.
Yeah, that's a great point. That's a great point. And, and the other word I was looking for, too, is acceptance. I don't have to agree, but I can accept something. And that happens a lot of times, of course, between the husband and wife relationship in terms of headship and submission and so forth. You may not agree, but you can accept. All right? So at times I feel like I'm not being heard. A word fitly spoken is like apples of gold. Don't overgeneralize in the things that we say. Okay, we're almost through with this section, then we'll take a little break, and then we'll pick up with some more specific things about how to approach it. But it begins by learning how to communicate effectively. It's edifying, and it's not bitter. It's edifying, and it's not bitter. I'm not going to take the time right now to read Ephesians 4:29-31, but the reminder there of what the Bible writer says, what Paul says about this outcry of shouting, and that we think about our speech, and that we're not bitter and angry and so forth. All right, well, here are some things that I think are bitter. I can't do anything to please you. You're such a baby. Can't you be more responsible? What were you thinking? What's your problem? You ever said any of these things? I can never understand you. I don't know why I put up with you. I told you so. You're just like your mother. You're always in a bad mood. If you don't like it, you can just leave. It's your fault. That was stupid. All you ever do is complain. And, I mean, the list goes on of things I can tell you. That's bitter and not helpful. Watch out. Now, you may feel, and you're frustrated, and we understand how frustrating it can be in a relationship. But what's the goal? Do we want to be heard? Do we want to try to resolve? Or do we want to make it worse? And some of these things make it worse. When we come back, we'll spend just a moment then saying that the second thing that we've got to do in terms of resolving conflict is work at communication and then learn to control our anger. Let's have a prayer, and then we'll take about a 10-minute break, okay? Father, thank you so much for this day. Thank you for all those who've gathered here and who are seeking to enrich their marriages. Lord, I pray your blessings on them, and help us all this day to do a better job at communicating and resolving conflict. In the name of Jesus we pray. Amen.